The narrator of this presentation is a stand-in because the budget didn't stretch to Morgan Freeman and the author is selectively mute. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. To write a story that breaches taboo and causes offense, that is, transgressive prose, a writer must imaginatively engage with the immoral acts and viewpoints being presented. Here I shall talk of my own process of immoral engagement, using the most transgressive and horrific short story that I have written to date. Tasteless comprises 1,149 words that have had readers turning it away from reputation alone. It is about a real crime committed by babysitter Tanya French and her partner Alan Webster that appeared on the BBC News website in May 2006, wherein the couple rape a 12-week-old baby. It would make sense to present Tasteless now, but the notion of hearing the story has been met with so much resistance that I have decided to omit it from the body of this presentation. So I now have the dubious task of reflecting on a story that I have been informally forbidden from presenting in context. Challenging. Before I get into the details of how Tasteless came into being, I briefly need to describe the creative process for all my stories. For me, a story starts in my internal greenhouse, where I keep hundreds of cuttings. These cuttings range from characters, snippets of dialogue, scenes, anecdotes, bits of film, music, news story snippets, and parts of texts I have read. Some of these cuttings die. Some sit and do not grow for years, and some of them cross-pollinate and create new plants that are more interesting and sturdier than the parent cuttings that combine to make them. It's an unpredictable environment, producing results that interest and excite me. Tasteless was a response to a challenge to write the worst thing that I could that was based on a true story. I took this gauntlet to my creative greenhouse and looked over what cuttings had stuck in my mind from news articles that I had read over the last few years. It was immediately obvious that this story of a couple using a baby as a sexual apparatus was the most suitable for the occasion. It had grown blunt roots and resisted abstract flora. When taking this cutting and cultivating it into a story, I did not try to stretch it out. I remained with this one scene and did not clutter it with excessive plot and characterization, keeping faithful to the material. I merely filled in the blanks of physical detail where most of the trauma seemed to lie. And here we must pause to reflect upon how transgressive text of this nature can cause feelings of unease, disgust, and abhorrence. How words printed on paper have the power to do anything to anyone at all. Interestingly, it's what the reader brings to the text that can make the piece more emotionally provocative. This active engagement makes the reader personally involved in the text. What is missing from the apparently trivial scenes, the gaps arising out of the dialogue, this is what stimulates the reader into filling the blanks with projections. He is drawn into the events and made to supply what is meant from what is not said. What is said only appears to take on significance as a reference to what is not said. It is the implications and not the statements that give shape and weight to the meaning. Tasteless takes this further, with lines directed to the reader, coaching them on through the story and denying any passiveness in the act of reading. I found the points in the text where these imperatives needed to be added by paying attention to when I flinched myself in the writing. In the writing of Tasteless, I, predictably, recoiled from my subject matter. I did not flinch from the words because they were accurate, and I have a stoic belief in accurate words over abstract description. I flinched from the images and their grounding in truth, the fact that this had happened. The clinical detachment in the tone of the piece was a form of authorial defense mechanism, as I filled in the blanks, got inside the room, up close to the acts that would implicate a woman as well as her male partner of sexual assault. Curiously, part of this defense was running to lesser things. I had already committed myself to horror. I'd spent approximately 2 hours searching for and reading through the worst cases of child sexual assault I could find in search of this one short article that had managed to stay so thoroughly embedded. I wasn't trying to feel better, just redirecting my mind to instances in a similar immoral vein that elicited a less severe visceral response. Like a rabbit running from the ferret into the fire, my mind turned to Auschwitz, to adult murder, to Myra Hindley, to rape, to torture, ad nauseum. It seemed only natural to illuminate and block off these mental retreats that I had recoiled down in the writing, in case the reader had a similar response. The reader, having gotten to the point in Tasteless where these literary side roads begin, has already become resigned to feeling terrible. After establishing the concrete but bare scene of the story, I fertilized the piece with that which would enhance its impact. I had decided that the purpose of this story was not to impart or entertain, but to impact and affect. The story was there, now I needed a vein running through it to maneuver the reader in to make it as effective as possible. This is where manipulation comes into play, both of the reader and the imparting of the story. The reader once begun is more often than not ensnared in the story. Questioning of the people who have read Tasteless revealed that the story drew them along. forcing them to read by directly confronting and dismissing their desire to stop and look away. In this situation, the reader has been trapped in the story, and the only thing to do is keep them trapped in the feeling, to allow the visceral reactions to what is being described to occur with their full attention, as opposed to allowing their attention to drift in self-preservation. The more aggressive the unflinching assault that bullies the reader into continuing on, the more emotional impact the story will have. As the bare facts of the crime alone are pretty horrendous, then no exaggeration needs to occur to really twist the knife. Manipulation therefore occurs in the delivery. It is the addition of these other examples of horror that season the atrocity that is this rape. The juxtaposition of those other instances of the depths to which humanity can sink, lone acts, entities and events considered heinous and appalling in isolation, somehow seem a favourable topic to the one being dissected in achingly close detail. And when you can look at an event and say, "It's not as bad as Auschwitz," then you know you've reached a new depth of atrocity. It is the factualness of the story, the point that these events could happen, that makes their text doubly upsetting. In The Puzzle of Imaginative Resistance, Gendler tells us that we resist horrific content if there could be a basis in truth, and that there is no imaginative resistance if there is no conceptual possibility. Let's say that the rape in this story is not based on fact. It's still fact-like, in that we know these unfortunate occurrences do happen, and the baby is still within the realms of our comparable imagination with the real world. This is non-distorting fiction, realistic. So let's say that it's not a baby at the centre of Tasteless. Change the baby to a dog. Cuts out the infant element that's pulling on the heartstrings, but it's still upsetting, because it's still within the realms of possibility. The scene is deportable without distortion. We'll take another step, so the victim is thrice removed. Let's say that it's a miniature xenomorph, whom these two sexual deviants find hidden in a house and decide to have their xenosexual way with. The situation becomes disconcerting, because it is ludicrous, but the savageness is absent now. There is an absence of a subject that we could associate with being tragically victimized in real life. It has become distorting fiction, where the mirroring between the fictional and the actual world is more complex. There is no straightforward export being offered in this bizarre example. Going yet one step further, let us take out all the real-world references, such as the Holocaust and the crimes of Myra Hindley, and we have effectively neutered the story. And now we come to the inevitable why. I write transgressive prose because I wish to explore in imagination how far the mind can go, what immoral acts and thoughts I and others are capable of as human beings. The most immoral people are not monsters, not other. This is a label we assign to distance ourselves from them, to deny that we also have the same potential for evil somewhere in our psyche. All it takes is the right defective trigger. The arts, particularly literature, offer much potential for wisdom and insight, less as direct sources of unambiguous moral prescription, more as imaginative explorations of human character and motive in a wide range of possible worlds and circumstances. In short, the primary moral or other educational role of especially literary artworks is not to tell us what to do, but to help us understand human nature. Do I feel that Tasteless should exist? After all, I wrote it. I'm not proud of it. I've not reread it outside of the 2 occasions when I have had to read it aloud, both times out of necessity. I am, however, proud of how it so effectively achieves its directive, to emotionally affect, and, from the feedback I've received, leave a lasting mark. As much as I wish I could unwrite Tasteless, as Einstein wished he could uninvent the atomic bomb, I am content with the fact that I wrote the story in the first place. I believe that transgressive texts serve a purpose in literature, simply one that is different to most texts. American Psycho is a criticism of materialism and the yuppie culture, seasoned with violence. Fight Club is a critique of consumerism and the curious emasculation of maleness in a patriarchal society, spiced up with madness. These kinds of stories are written to confront moral or social boundaries, to highlight by transgressing, and magnifying engagement with acidic catalysts. What is easier forgotten, the lulling romance story, or the piece that burns a hole through your gut and leaves you crying out for mental bleach?
Everybody's going to the party, have a